Next up is Lisa Ludeman, also with the U.S. Agency for International Development, who's going to be speaking about support for drug regulatory systems. So welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So I am going to speak to the reasons for USAID's involvements and changes over time in drug regulatory system strengthening. And first I want to mention just where I sit. So I sit in our Office of Health Systems. We're a large bureau in the Bureau for Global Health. So I may be a tad biased on the publication that I'm showing here, which is our Vision for Health System Strengthening. But in the area of providing technical support for regulatory system strengthening, the agency does really view this as a central part of our health system strengthening efforts, particularly in the area of medicines, vaccines, and technologies function of the health system. So a couple of years ago, we published this Vision for Health System Strengthening. It addresses all of the functional areas of the health system and identifies priority objectives for each, while really putting an emphasis also on the system's outcome and ultimately improved health outcomes. So the priority objectives that we have as an agency for the medicines component is first and foremost increase access to essential health commodities, primarily through strengthened supply chains. Secondly, also pharmaceutical services delivery to ensure appropriate use so that products not only are where they need to be, but they're also used appropriately to have the intended health outcomes, protect patient safety, and also increasingly an emphasis on combating antimicrobial resistance through appropriate use. And third, strengthening regulatory capacity, as well as addressing, as part of that, and throughout the pharmaceutical system, pharmaceutical sector governance as well. And so I'm going to sort of flip the two topics that I was asked to touch on today. So I wanted to just give my take on the sort of changes over time from my perspective and sort of what I know about the history of the Bureau and agency in the area of medicines. So first and foremost, USAID has supported programs to deliver priority health products and have them available where and when needed for decades, I can say. And this has primarily been for specific disease programs. And with the view that having products available when and where needed is absolutely critical for the success of our health programs. You may have heard the phrase "no product, no program." So that has first and foremost been our emphasis. Then followed shortly thereafter by an emphasis on pharmaceutical services, meaning the interaction between providers, for example, and patients in the area of pharmacy practices and counseling dispensing, with a recognition that to continue with the adage, no pharmaceutical service, no health outcome. However, in the process of doing that, we've recognized that actually achieving health outcomes is much more nuanced and has to do with many other factors as well, particularly and more recently, regulatory system strengthening, in the sense that products may be where they need to be, and even the right services may be provided, and if they're not of the right quality, and if they're unsafe for the users, then health outcomes won't necessarily be achieved. So we have seen sort of in the first two categories for a while now primary investments in that area, and perhaps sort of secondary investments in regulatory system strengthening, meaning that that we were able as an agency to secure funding to work on regulatory system strengthening sort of in the service of the first two. However, increasingly we're seeing also now primary investments being made by our agency in regulatory system strengthening sort of in its own right, with a recognition of the role of a strong regulatory system as a public health good. And I could talk a little bit more about that, but that's something that we've been excited to see. And then our reasons for involvement. So this is also sort of my take on what motivates us as an agency in the area of regulatory system strengthening for medicine specifically, medical products. So we are certainly supporting countries as they endeavor to expand coverage of health services. And one of the angles on that is an opportunity and also a potential risk, depending on the quality of those services, including the products that are provided. So we see that as an area that has allowed the conversation to extend into, what is the quality and safety and efficacy of the products being provided, and that they are not causing, for example, financial hardship in the process of individuals receiving the care and products that they need. We know that medicines are very costly to health systems and also to individuals, and so we've been able to highlight the angle that if we don't address the medicines component, for example, of universal health coverage schemes, we're not actually going to be helping our partner countries to ultimately get where they're trying to go. Secondly, aside from sort of the coverage argument, looking at regulatory systems in their own right, recognizing that the countries that we are supporting have growing pharmaceutical markets in many of the countries that are growing more quickly than the capacity of the regulatory system to provide oversight of those markets, both from a public health perspective as well as allowing for healthy and competitive markets that that favor the producers of quality products and can safeguard against the presence of products that are, for example, substandard or even falsified. So really viewing regulatory system strengthening from a public health side as local markets grow quickly. Also, looking at the angle of new product introduction, and I apologize that I wasn't able to hear the sessions this morning, so some of this may already have been covered, but recognizing that there are increasingly products that are being introduced directly into developing country markets with limited safety data. So basically relying on the capability of the regulatory authority, for example, pharmacovigilance system, to be able to follow those products and ensure their safety. So all of those first ones to sort of say that increasingly as an agency, we are advocating for and, sort of externally and similarly within our own staff for the public health angle and regulatory system strengthening. Also, USAID has a increasing emphasis on our journey to self-reliance. And within this space of the health system overall, as well as the subsystems like the pharmaceutical system and even the regulatory system beyond that, recognizing that resources need to be used optimally in that context for the maximum public health benefit. And within that context, However, that self-reliance doesn't mean that individual countries are their own sort of islands and need to go it alone and do everything on their own. And that so in that sense, we certainly support the efforts of others mentioned here today to support regulatory harmonization across countries. And yeah, so we have been supporting with technical assistance efforts in Africa as well as Asia to look at models of regulatory harmonization and building capacity. One other thing I wanted to mention in the process of this is our emphasis on strong partnerships. For example, the World Health Organization Coalition of Interested Partners has been mentioned today, and as well as the Global Benchmarking Tool. So through our implementing partners and mechanisms, we very much support a unified approach to strengthening regulatory systems. And definitely, I echo the sentiments mentioned earlier of the importance of having these unified assessments that can align all donor efforts, as well as the value of institutional development plans, and that's something that's allowed the agency to give a focus to the type of implementation support that we do at the country level. In terms, going back to the optimal use of resources, a couple other areas that we view as very important to support optimal use of resources is the importance of data standardization that's been discussed today, as well as data systems that connect products and patients. So through our work as an agency, we provide a lot of support to a lot of different systems that are information systems within, for example, supply chain, regulatory, pharmacovigilance, pharmacy systems, hospital systems, and increasingly putting an emphasis on how those can become interoperable with each other to connect the product and the patient and not have them operating in silos. And part of that is this increased use of global standards, for example, GS1, but also other standards, and definitely recognize, as others have mentioned, the complexity behind that, but the intention is there as the agency to support countries as they endeavor to do that, both to address fragmentation within their borders, but also to facilitate regulatory harmonization or even reliance and networking efforts. And last but certainly not least, the notion of the risk-based approaches for prioritization. So through some of the projects that I support directly as a technical advisor, we're working on developing practical methodologies for example, drug quality surveillance, risk prioritization, recognizing that we need to help countries target their resources to the area of greatest need. And this also provides diagnosis for where we can support countries and donors as a donor to make investments where needed. So with all of this said, for all of the reasons and sort of I guess emerging considerations, as we're calling them, for opportunities for USAID to continue investing in regulatory system strengthening. There is still definitely a need for continued advocacy and awareness of the importance of regulatory system strengthening to our overall health programs. It was interesting listening to other colleagues with sort of dedicated budgets in this area. As a global health bureau, we work a little bit differently, where we have disease programs, and that's sort of how our funding works. And so we have developed and methods to kind of combine and leverage funding to do the cross-cutting system strengthening work, but that continued advocacy from you all as well as internally is definitely needed, recognizing that There's a lot of positive opportunities with the growth in coverage and expansion of markets, but also the need to protect patients and consumers and health systems. And I am going to stop there. Thank you.